I'm with Michael Jantzi, certainly one of the leaders of this space, the CEO of Sustainalytics. Michael, great to see you. All the talk at the moment is of responsible investment hitting the mainstream at a pivot point. Are we? What's your take on that?
Well, I agree with you, Daniel, and it's a pleasure to be here. I do think we're at a pivotal point for responsible investment in ESG. I think it's an inflection point for our industry, and I feel hopeful that our industry as a whole will be able to grasp this opportunity, because we certainly do have an opportunity to inform and shape the world as it's going to look moving forward. So we can talk a little bit more about this, but I do think this is a litmus test for the industry. There's no question in my mind.
You're not the first person I've spoken to who's mentioned litmus test, but how does, the implication for the investment industry in the new normal? You've got different societal expectations. You've got this talk of stakeholder capitalism. What are the implications for all of us in the sector?
Well, maybe even before I go to implications, I'll talk a little bit about, why I feel as strongly as I do about this, and what is really motivating me to look forward, because I do get a lot of questions in regards to, despite what we read in the media and the fact that people are talking about this, why do I think that we are at this inflection point and the opportunity for our industry to really step up? The one reason is just history a little bit, and I smile because although the investment industry always says, past performance is no guarantee of the future, of course, we look at past performance all the time. And I think for our industry, if you look at responsible investment, it's not only navigated challenging times, it's thrived and has come out of these challenges more strongly than it was previously. And you can go back to the early 2000s when you had the WorldCom, Tyco, Enron, Parmalat, the governance debacles, and that was a challenge for at least ESG, in the sense that people weren't sure what was going to happen, and yet there was a catalyst to further growth. We had the PRI then launch in 2006, and on its heels we had the global financial crisis in 08 and 09, and another crisis in 11. And these were all things that were challenges, obviously, to things beyond responsible investment, but there was a lot of talk about the fact that, well, now things are tough, responsible investment is going to take a back seat. And of course, nothing could be farther from the truth. So I think, again, we're facing challenges that go well beyond the capital markets. But again, ESG and responsible investment seems well positioned to take the next step. But I also think what the pandemic is doing is really bringing home the fact that systemic risks are real. So we've talked about these systemic risks that go well beyond any one particular actor's ability to address, and the tragedy of the commons and these types of things. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the pandemic. The response has had to be multilateral, global, actors having to work together in almost unprecedented ways to address the challenges that we face. And so I think we have real life lessons here in regards to both the impacts of systemic risks and our ability to manage those. And I also think one of the things that has really been laid bare is the cost of inaction. So we've talked about, the fact that if we don't address climate change or, income disparity and some of these types of things, it's an ongoing conversation in responsible investment community that we're going to have to pay the piper at some point. But it's always been a conversation where that impact has been somewhere out there. It's been tough to really feel it and experience it. And now we are. And so the fact is that if you read what the health professionals are saying and so on, inaction has led to very negative outcomes. And the costs of not acting quickly enough or meaningfully enough are real, and people are experiencing that. They're feeling that. And so I think that's having an impact on stakeholders more broadly, whether it's government, the public at large, and investors and companies. And so I do think the things we've been talking about are resonating, and they're real. And so I do think that there's now an opportunity to step up because people understand that these things can have negative consequences if we don't act. So those things make me hopeful that the inflection point that we're at provides a real opportunity for those of us in this industry and capital markets more generally.
So in terms of the implications for the industry, I mean, how does it respond going forward?
Well, it's a great question, Daniel, and the fact is, you noted stakeholder capitalism, and I think it's a great term. And of course, before the pandemic hit, within the investment community and the corporate community, there was this trending, if you will, or momentum away from the shareholder primacy model to stakeholder capitalism. I actually think what's happening a little bit through this pandemic is we're going to see a broadening and a redefining of, I think, what stakeholder capitalism means. I think it's going to go well beyond the conversation of the corporation or the investor. In fact, the investor has sort of been absent from many of the conversations around the pandemic in a sense. And so I think what stakeholder capitalism is going to broaden to mean is relationships between government and companies and investors and the public. And so I think the whole social contract is being redefined as we speak. So I do think that expectations on investors now are going to broaden because there'll be an expectation by all of us that the dialogue is not going to be only with their stakeholders within their sphere of influence, but will now involve a much broader range of conversations in a much more collaborative way. I think that the expectations of investors before the pandemic were changing. I mean, the fact is that certainly it was seen as not just an opportunity, but the responsibility increasingly of investors to finance transition, to finance what we need to do to address those issues highlighted through the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that has just, this pandemic has just been a catalyst to heighten that responsibility. I don't think some of the things that are happening here and the responses you can just sort of shove back into the box, right? Like, I don't think, for example, corporations are going to be able to say to governments in the future as easily, get off my back, let me operate, lower taxes, when they were clamoring for stimulus in order to help them survive. I don't think we're, as a society, going to be able to, push back into the box the way we've been treating the most vulnerable in society, like seniors, or I don't think we're going to be able to redefine what essential services or essential worker means when we've defined it as those on sort of the low end of the wage totem pole. Those aren't going to go away, and so I do think that conversation is just going to broaden, and the expectations on investors to begin to address some of those issues are going to increase coming out of this. It's interesting to me too that for those of us in the ESG space, of course, it all started with governance, and that was the focus, and the E and the S took short thrift. Then the focus really moved to the E, dominated by climate, of course, and the S was always sort of that poor country cousin, if you will. And there were a lot of folks that were lamenting the fact that S didn't get a lot of the focus. Well, that has changed through this pandemic. So yes, we're talking about climate and so on, but a lot of the issues that have emerged and that people are talking about, broadly speaking, are those that are in that social bucket. So it's about income and wage disparity. It's about the fragility of the supply chains and the fragility of supply chains that are key to life, like food security. It's about taxes, and support of public services and those types of things. So I think as we emerge out of this, for responsible investors, again, expectations along the E, the S, and the G are going to be sort of equal standing now, and so I think that puts heightens on them. So, where the expectations on investors were to support the transition in the SDGs, I think that exponentially has increased. I think that the expectations that the broad stakeholders, government and investors, clients are going to have for investors to look at impact and outcomes and to finance those solutions are going to go up. And alongside that, Daniel, I think that, you know, the information we're seeing about performance of ESG focused mandates being very strong, I think that just is going to heighten the expectation on unit holders and plan members that investors are going to be able to achieve all these impact oriented outcomes alongside strong financial performance. So I do think it is going to be an environment of heightened expectations for the investment community.
There's a lot of talk at the moment about resilience, whether that's portfolio resilience or corporate resilience, societal resilience. In a way, that's, in a sense, that's long-termism. And there's been a lot of talk about long-termism in investment, but we're in a short-term crisis. How do we reconcile the one with the other?
Yeah, I don't have an answer for that. And so I agree with your statement that, you know, pre-crisis, pre-COVID, there was certainly a move towards a longer-term investment horizon. I don't think that this crisis is going to dampen that move, or certainly not reverse it, because again, I do believe that at least on my more optimistic days, that this pandemic is highlighting the fact that unless we address some of these, you know, systemic challenges and that are, you know, long-term threats, or we thought of them as longer-term threats or something that might bite us down the road, I think that the short-term focus lends itself to a catalyst for longer-term thinking. So I'm not, you know, my experience with human beings is we're not the best at shifting behaviors. So I think on that one, outside of the investment outlook, I think the more profound question is whether or not some of the things that we've been forced to do over the last 2.5 months globally as individuals are going to have a lasting long-term effect. And I think so, but I mean, will the nature of work change? Will, you know, consumer buying habits change? Will we see less travel? You know, all of those sorts of things are questions left to be answered. So while I expect we'll see a shift back, I think the new normal will change and there will be longer lasting impacts. And I don't think that the investment community will be separate or immune from some of those longer term changes.
Of course, the biggest long-term issue we face is climate change. How do we muster people around, stakeholders around the low carbon transition, Michael?
Yeah, well, I think it is interesting to me that I mean, it's been more than a public health crisis, but it hasn't been an environmental crisis, or at least in its infancy. But the talk about climate change and other sort of issues like that have certainly been front and center. And so again, I think that again, on my more the days where I have more optimism, I think again the fact that we've seen how a crisis impacts not just markets but the economy as a whole and our lives as a whole. And I do think one of the lessons we can take for this is that when the risks are real, we have the ability to act collectively. We have the ability to act quickly and meaningfully. And in this case, fortunately, that's had some positive impact. So I think with climate, I'm optimistic that maybe the message is that we still have some time to act, and we do need to act. But the fact of the matter is that one of the challenges has been we haven't been able to muster the capital required to fund that transition. And this has been a theme for me for, you know, the 30 years of my career, Daniel. When I stepped into this space, it was about ethical investing, and it was about avoiding those companies that were, quote, doing bad things. And that didn't really align with my theory of change, which was, well, we have an opportunity to leverage capital, get it into the hands of those companies that were doing a better job than some of their competitors, and that, from my theory of change perspective, should be a strong message to bring companies along a pathway or a continuum. And that's why we developed the best of sector approach in the early 90s. So thus far, the funding that we've seen through green bonds, for example, and it's a tremendous, I'm very supportive of it, but it's really funded green companies. And we've had trouble finding ways or being comfortable with the fact of dealing with sort of brown industries or brown companies, but those are the companies that we have to transition. And so, you know, from my perspective, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about transition frameworks and the need to do it, and it is need. It's not just an investment opportunity. I really do believe we have a moral imperative to fund companies who are legitimately looking to change their business models, start the journey towards transition, and are looking for funding on a use of proceeds or an activity level, which is strengthening that changing business model. And so I think we have to become comfortable with mechanisms, frameworks, and experiments, in a sense, that are not going to be perfect, but we're finding ways for a mass allocation of capital, an allocation of capital at scale that is allowing industries that have been outside of the green financing to change those business models. Because again, the lessons from this pandemic are highlighting the fact that the challenges are real. They need a significant response in the very short term if we're going to have a chance to turn things around and avoid some of the negative impacts that the scientists are telling us are coming if they're not already here. And so I think for this industry and for Sustainalytics, and for me as a personal motivation as a CEO, I want to make sure that we're contributing to that transition in a meaningful way, and meaningful in regards to getting capital at scale into hands, but doing so in a way which avoids greenwashing or green wishing.
Great thoughts, Michael. Really, really great to speak with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.